Hello. It was a pretty exciting day yesterday with the release of the Canon EOS R5 and R6. Looking at the specs of these two cameras, this could be one of the biggest camera releases Canon has ever had. In fact, it could be the biggest upgrade to Canon's lineup since the 5D Mark II was introduced. First of all, let's start off with the most exciting camera, the R5. Now this camera, as was rumoured, is capable of shooting 8K RAW with its full frame sensor, and the RAW files that it shoots are fairly usable. It's not quite as efficient as Blackmagic RAW, which in turn is not quite as efficient as Apple ProRes, but there's not a huge amount of difference between the data rates. I mean, all of these codecs have been used for different frame rates and stuff, so it is a bit hard to compare them. But I'm going off the assumption that the RAW that the EOS R5 is recording is roughly a 5:1 compression, which does result in file sizes that would be about the same as a 3:1 compression with Blackmagic RAW. So it's not a perfect comparison. If you want small file sizes, you're gonna have a bad day. But if you just care about having 8K RAW, it's not a stupidly large file as it would be if the camera was using Cinema DNG. Now, rather sadly, if you decided that 8K RAW was just too big, you don't want to deal with the file sizes, and you'd rather shoot in 4K, well, there's no 4K RAW. My guess is that the camera is just taking the entire sensor for the 8K. It does the entire sensor readout, which is roughly 8K, just crams it into the Canon RAW format and then shoots it off to the CFast card, and it's just not my problem, not my problem, not my problem. Whereas if it was to shoot 4K, it would have to downsample the image in camera, and I'm assuming that a camera that small does not have the power to downsample an 8K sensor to 4K, so I think that's the explanation for why there is no 4K RAW. But to make up for it, there is 120 FPS in 4K. 120 FPS is more than the Canon C200 can do. I mean, that's going to be really nice if you are into slow motion, but you don't want to have to drop down to 1080p to get your slow motion sequences. Whilst I'm not 100% sure on this, I am fairly certain that the EOS R5 will be able to record 4K to an external recorder, such as an Atomos Ninja Inferno or a Ninja 5. So if you do want 4K ProRes, that should hopefully be possible via an external recorder. But you may not need one, because there is 10-bit 422 recording internally, both in 8K and in 4K. This is perfect if you don't want to deal with a raw workflow, or if you want high quality 4K files. 10-bit and 422 just give you much more data to work with when it comes to color grading and post-production. Interestingly, despite the 4K at 120 FPS, if you drop the resolution down to 1080p, you can only go up to 60 FPS. So you have to raise the resolution for a higher frame rate. Sadly, there's no 240 FPS 1080p. But to be honest, with 120 FPS in 4K, there is really not much to be complaining about as far as slow motion goes. Now, as I'm sure there are going to be some comments on this, and actually I've seen comments on other videos regarding this subject, this does not mean the end of cinema cameras such as the C200, C300 Mark III, and even cinema cameras from other brands. The EOS R5 is not going to completely replace them, and that's because of one very, very important spec, and that is dynamic range. Now, I'm not actually sure what the dynamic range is. I've had a look on the internet at various different R5 reviews. There are a few already out, but they just say that the dynamic range is good. Well, cool. I'm glad the dynamic range is good. I mean, what's good? 15 stops? Sadly, it's very unlikely to be 15 stops, because if you look at the log recording options, there is only Canon log, the original Canon log 1, which on all other Canon cameras is 12 stops of dynamic range. So I would be surprised if it's doing much more than that. Now, having said that, when the camera is recording in RAW, you might get more than 12 stops of dynamic range. Because of the way RAW works, you don't actually have to shoot in log. So I don't know what the dynamic range in 8K RAW is. I will have to wait to see some reviews, but at least as far as I can tell, because of that spec, the R5 will not be replacing cinema cameras for people who are serious about getting the maximum possible dynamic range. And as I haven't mentioned it already, and it is worth saying with Canon cameras, the 4K as well as the 8K is full frame, no cropping into the sensor. So 8K RAW, full frame yes, and also 4K full frame. But it's not just the resolutions and the recording formats that have been upgraded. Oh no, there's also Canon's new second generation of dual pixel autofocus, which can now work on various animals. I believe cats and dogs have been listed, perhaps birds too. Interesting to see what animals it works on and what animals it doesn't. Like, yes, that's a dog that's in focus, but elephants? We don't do elephants over here. And the other pretty cool upgrade is finally Canon cameras now have IBIS, or in-body image stabilization, which is where the sensor in the camera is capable of moving to stabilize your footage. Now it's not as good as having a gimbal, but especially if you have an image stabilized lens, you can get surprisingly smooth footage just walking around with the camera in a handheld way. So especially for the more video side of things, for YouTubers and the vloggers, I mean, it's quite expensive, but this could be a big hit. Talking of vloggers and YouTubers, there's not a whole lot of footage on the internet right now, but Peter McKinnon has made a video, in fact he's made a couple of videos about the R5 and the R6, which I have watched, and the image quality from those two videos looks pretty good. The only thing is that those videos are made in his sort of YouTuber vlogging style, so I would be interested to see what happens if the R5 is used on like a very controlled, structured shoot, but for now, at least we do have some nice test footage to look at. So that's the R5, on to the R6, which is basically just a toned down version of the R5. Like the R5, you get the in-body image stabilization and the second generation, the improved dual pixel autofocus. However, there is no 8K RAW, and in terms of 4K recording, well, you don't get 120 FPS, you only get 60. I say only 60, you know, that's what the C200 can do. 60 FPS is still very good, but rather excitingly, which I didn't entirely expect, the R6, that also has the 10-bit 422 recording, as well as Canon lock, and if you're prepared to go down to 1080p, then you can still have 120 FPS slow motion. So, these are the good parts of the two new cameras, but what about the price? Well, the R5 comes in at £4,200, which is quite expensive, but considering it can do 8K RAW, that's not unreasonable. I will admit that I do feel sorry for all of the photographers that really want an R5 and have no intention of shooting video. Yeah, someone did point this out in my 1DX Mark III video, but all of these new video features have now made your camera £1,000 more expensive. Sorry, photographers. But at least there's the R6 as well, which is a fair bit cheaper. The R6 comes in at $2,500, which is still expensive, but it's nearly half the price of the R5. Just for reference, if you look at an EOS R right now, that's about $1,800. Conclusions: should you buy the camera, and which one should you buy? Well, first of all, unless you can find a really good deal on the original EOS R, and I mean under £1,500 kind of good deal, I would hesitate to buy one now. I would really go for the R6. Yes, it's going to be a few £100 more expensive, but there are so many extra features. Full frame 4K at 60 FPS, the internal 422 10-bit, really it makes complete sense to go for the R6 because there's a lot more video features on offer than they are in the original EOS R. But what about the R5, which, as I said, is nearly twice the price of the R6? Well, I do think it is worth it. If you look at the specs, for £4,200, it is justifiable. You know, if you want 8K RAW, well, you can get that in a small mirrorless camera, so that does make the R5 worth going for. What I think is perhaps a more interesting question is, should you buy an R5 or a C200? And honestly, if you're not doing much photography, I would be very tempted to go for the C200, purely for the extra dynamic range. 15 stops versus if the R5 can do 12, as I suspect it will, and that's pretty big difference. So that is the camera portion of this video, the R5 and the R6, but there are also some new lenses that were announced, and they're not hugely expensive. The RF 85mm f2 would be a good lens to add to your kit after you've got, say, a 24-105 or one of the other RF lenses. It's also a macro, so if you want to do close-up shots, well, the 85 is going to be a good choice for that. So that looks like a pretty solid lens. If you want to do some sports or maybe some nature, then there's also a 600mm RF and an 800mm RF. They could be pretty good, although you should bear in mind that they are quite slow at f11. They might be good for astroimaging or astrophotography, which my dad does do quite a bit of, but I'm not sure if f11 is really fast enough for capturing the night sky, which is quite dark. That's kind of stating the obvious now. He's got this sort of telescope lens type thing, which I think is around f4 to f5.6, which is a fair bit faster than f11. And finally, as far as lenses go, there is now also a 100 to 500mm f4.5 to 7.1 lens, which if you want a telephoto that's got a bit more reach than the 70 to 200, well, you now have one. So there you go. You have your sports and wildlife lenses all covered with this new release of RF lenses. And if that wasn't enough, there are now two RF mount lens extenders, a 1.4 and a 2x, which will give your lenses a little bit more reach. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please consider leaving a like and subscribing so as not to miss any new videos. See you later.